The sun was trying to kill everything that afternoon. It pressed down on the main street of Calhoun Flats like a hand on the back of a kneeling man, and the dust it stirred was the color of old bone. Elias Cord stood at the water trough outside Halverson's Feed and Grain, running a wet rag along the neck of his roan mare, not because the horse needed it particularly, but because the act of it kept his hands from doing something else. Kept them honest. He was a tall man, and spare. The kind of lean that comes not from hunger but from years of burning everything unnecessary away. His face was a map of decisions made and not regretted, and the colt on his hip rode low in the way that meant it had been drawn more than a man ought to need to draw a thing. He heard the boy before he saw him. Small footsteps in loose dirt, deliberate and terrified at once. Mister. Cord didn't turn. He kept the rag moving along the mare's neck. Mister, please. He turned then. The boy was perhaps 9 years old, maybe 10. His shirt was 2 sizes too big and his boots were cracked along the soles and his eyes were the kind of wide that belongs to children who have witnessed things they cannot yet name. He held out his hand, palm up, and in it lay $3 silver. They caught the light like small prayers. That's all I got, the boy said. Every cent I saved since February. Cord looked at the coins. He looked at the boy's face. He looked past the boy at the doorway of Doc Hennis's office across the street, where a woman's pale hand rested against the frame of the door, barely visible in the shade. What's your name, son? Caleb. Caleb Whitmore. And what do you want me to do, Caleb? The boy's jaw tightened. He was working hard not to cry, and the effort of it was something to witness. My mama's sick, he said. And there's men coming. And I need somebody they'll be afraid of. The whole street was watching. Cord knew it without looking. He could feel the weight of every eye from the barber shop, from the dry goods store, from the rocking chairs under the awning of the hotel. A town watching to see what a man was made of. He reached out and closed the boy's fingers over the $3 silver. Put that away, he said quietly. The boy's face broke. I'll need something more useful than money, Cord said. I'll need you to take me to your mother. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The Whitmore place sat 3 miles east of Calhoun Flats on a stretch of scrubland that the territory had not been generous with. There was a house, a barn listing slightly to the west as though it had been listening to something and never straightened back up, a dry creek bed, and a half-finished fence that suggested a man had started something and run out of either time or will before he could finish it. Caleb rode behind Cord on the roan, silent the whole way except once, when he said, "She's been sick since May." He didn't elaborate, and Cord didn't ask. The girl came out of the house before they dismounted. She was perhaps 7, with her brother's same dark eyes and a seriousness about the mouth that no child that age ought to have earned yet. She held a broom handle in both hands like a weapon, and she looked at Cord with a measuring quality that reminded him of certain card players he'd known. "That's May," Caleb said. "She won't say much." May said nothing. She watched Cord swing down from the saddle and she watched him loop the reins around the fence post and she watched him take off his hat before stepping onto the porch. Something in that last gesture must have satisfied her, because she stepped aside. The interior of the house was dim and smelled of camphor and unwashed linen and the faint sweetness of fever. It was not a dirty house so much as a house that had been loved and then, in the last several months, simply survived. A pot sat on the iron stove with something in it that had gone past edible. Clothes hung over chair backs. A cracked window had been sealed with brown paper and pine pitch. On the table, a single tallow candle burned down to its last inch. Clara Whitmore lay in the bed near the back wall, and she was younger than Cord had expected, which made the exhaustion on her face that much harder to look at directly. She had the bones of a woman who had once been strong in the way frontier women are strong, which is to say not dramatically, not with any visible armor, but continuously. Like a fence post that holds through years of weather because it was set deep from the beginning. Whatever sickness had moved into her, it had been eating at those reserves for some time. She looked at Cord with eyes that held neither fear nor particular welcome. Just the flat assessment of a woman who had learned to read situations quickly because nobody was going to read them for her. "Caleb," she said. "Mama, this is Mr. Cord. He's going to help." "I didn't ask for help." "No'm," Cord said. "You didn't." She studied him. "You're a gunfighter." "I've been other things." "Are you one now?" He considered the question honestly. "I suppose it depends on what comes through the door." She didn't respond to that. Her hands lay flat on the quilt, and Cord noticed they were chapped raw along the knuckles, which told him she had been working far longer into the sickness than was wise. He looked around the room and made a quiet inventory of what the house needed, which was considerable, and what it had, which was less. "Can you eat?" he asked her. "She hasn't eaten since yesterday," May said from the doorway. It was the first thing the girl had spoken. She said it plainly, without drama, the way you report a broken axle. Cord walked to the stove. He lifted the lid on the pot and looked inside, then set the lid back down. He went outside to the barn and found what he needed: salt pork, dried beans that had been stored properly, half a sack of cornmeal. He found a clay jug of water that was clean, and he found wild onions growing along the shaded side of the barn wall. He brought all of it inside. He built up the fire without asking permission. He emptied the old pot, washed it at the basin with water he heated first, and started the beans from the beginning. He diced the salt pork and rendered it slow, adding the onions when the fat ran clear, letting the smell of it change the character of the room by degrees. May came and stood near the stove without being invited, watching his hands with the same seriousness she'd watched everything else. "You know how to make cornbread?" Cord asked her. "Yes." "Make it." She did, without another word, measuring by eye with the confidence of a child who had been doing it since she was old enough to reach the bowl. She built the jarny cake flat in the iron skillet and set it to the side of the stove where the heat would catch it slow. Caleb had been hovering in the space between helpful and underfoot, and Cord gave him something simple: fill the wood box, straighten the chairs, draw fresh water from the well out back. The boy moved with the focused relief of someone who has been terrified and has finally been handed a task to pour that terror into. They ate late in the afternoon, the light outside gone amber and forgiving. Cord helped Clara to the table because it was practical, and she allowed it because she was too weak to be proud about it. Though the set of her shoulders said that she noted the compromise and intended to repay the debt by getting well quickly. He set a bowl before her, beans thick with the rendered pork, a heel of the jarny cake alongside it, and she looked at it for a moment before picking up the spoon. Caleb ate with the single-minded intensity of a boy who had been managing his hunger for days, perhaps longer. May ate carefully, methodically, like someone storing the experience away. Nobody spoke much. The fire in the stove clicked and breathed. Outside, a mourning dove went at it from somewhere in the scrub oaks, and the sound of it moved through the room without disturbing anything. When Clara set her spoon down, she had eaten more than Cord had expected. She looked across the table at him. "What do you want?" she asked. Not unkindly. Plainly. "Tonight?" "Nothing," he said. "Tomorrow we can talk about what's coming and what it'll take." She nodded once. He helped her back to the bed. She was asleep before he'd pulled the door halfway closed. Morning came in sideways through the cracked and papered window, laying a bar of pale gold across the plank floor. Cord was already awake. He'd slept in the barn, which was where he'd intended to sleep, on a bedroll he'd carried behind his saddle for years. He'd woken once in the dark hours and lain listening to the land, which had told him nothing alarming yet. Yet was an important word. He split wood at first light because the wood box needed filling beyond what Caleb had managed. And because the sound of the axe and the smell of fresh split cedar was a thing that oriented him in the mornings. May appeared on the porch at some point and watched him work without speaking, the broom in her hands again, though she wasn't sweeping. Just holding it. After a while she went inside and he heard her begin to move around the kitchen. He finished the wood and stacked it and came in to find she'd started coffee from grounds that were barely adequate for the purpose, but she'd compensated by packing the pot tight. He didn't say anything about the coffee. He drank it like it was fine. Clara was improved marginally. Not well, not even close, but the color at the edges of her face had shifted from grey toward something more like a person. She sat up against the headboard and directed May on the biscuits from across the room, calling out measurements in a voice still thin from fatigue. May nodded at each instruction, though her hands had already done it correctly before the instruction arrived. After breakfast, Cord took Caleb outside to look at the fence. "Your daddy built this?" Cord asked. "Started it. He died in March." Caleb said it the way children say hard facts when they've said them enough times that the saying of it has become separate from the feeling of it. The feeling was still there, you could see it in the stillness around his eyes. But the words had been worn smooth. "What took him?" "Snake got his horse. Horse fell on him crossing the creek." "It was fast," Doc Hennessy said. Caleb paused. I don't know if Doc Hennessy was being kind or honest. Cord looked at him. "Probably both," he said. "Sometimes those things run together." They worked the fence line through the morning. Cord showed Caleb how to test a post for rot, pressing his thumb into the wood at the soil line to feel for give, and how to drive a replacement deep enough that the first frost wouldn't heave it. The boy worked alongside him without complaint, asking questions that were practical rather than conversational. He was already, at 10 years old, making the calculation about what needed to be learned and learning it. May appeared at midday with water and a cloth tied around bread and dried fruit. She set it on a fence post without ceremony and went back to the house. She doesn't say much, Caleb noted, but she doesn't miss anything. Cord drank the water and watched the house. "Sounds about right," he said. 40 miles southwest, in a town called Reedy Cross, a man named Dolan Pruitt was cleaning his fingernails with a knife and listening to a land agent named Greer tell him what he already knew. Pruitt was the kind of man who looked, at first glance, less dangerous than he was. He was heavy-set and moved unhurriedly, and his face was pleasant enough in a broad, red-cheeked way that made people think of somebody's uncle. He had bought that impression deliberately over many years, and he maintained it the way a careful man maintains a useful tool. "The woman's sick," Greer said. "She's got no deed in her name. The husband filed on it under his name before the war records got sorted, and with him gone, the title's in dispute." "Is it?" Pruitt said. It was not a question. "County recorder says there's a 90-day window for contesting. That window closes September." "What month is it?" "August." Pruitt folded the knife and put it away. "How sick is she?" "Sick enough." "But..." Greer shifted in his seat. "I heard she's got somebody out there now. Somebody watching the place." "Who?" Name people said was Cord. "Elias Cord." A silence moved through the room. Greer watched Pruitt's pleasant face and waited. "Cord," Pruitt repeated, with the particular flatness of a man filing information in a place he can retrieve it quickly. "You know him." "I know of him." Pruitt stood. "It doesn't change what needs doing. It changes how we do it." He reached for his hat. "Get me 2 men who aren't idiots." "You find that difficult?" Greer said he'd try. "Try hard," Pruitt said, and walked out into the white afternoon. Calhoun Flats had the particular social architecture of a small western town, which is to say that every interaction in it carried information beyond what was spoken. And the currency of judgment moved faster than money and with considerably more damage. Cord took Clara into town on a Thursday, 8 days after he'd first arrived at the Whitmore place. She was strong enough to sit the wagon seat if she braced herself, and there were things she needed from the dry goods store that could not wait. And Cord had decided that visibility was its own kind of protection. Let the town see her upright and attended to. Let whatever story was being told have to compete with the actual woman. Caleb came along. May stayed home with a rifle she clearly knew how to hold, which had surprised Cord the first time he'd seen it and no longer did. The wagon rolled down the main street and Cord could feel the town adjust around them the way a room adjusts when someone enters it carrying weather. Heads turned. Conversations lowered. The particular silence of people who have been talking and don't intend to stop but recognize they must pause. He helped Clara down from the wagon. She took his arm because the street was uneven and she was still not steady, but her chin was up and her step was deliberate, and nobody watching her would have described her as a woman defeated. Halverson's dry goods smelled of burlap and tobacco and the iron tang of nails in the barrel by the door. Walt Halverson himself was behind the counter, a man of 50 with the face of someone who had spent considerable time being disappointed by his circumstances. He looked at Clara with the particular expression of a man who has already formed an opinion and is simply waiting to see if you'll confirm it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Heard you've been poorly." "Getting better," Clara said. "Good to hear." His eyes moved to Cord. They went over him slowly, tallying. "Don't believe I know you." "Elias Cord. Staying out at the Whitmore place." "For now." The silence that followed was the kind that towns are skilled at manufacturing. Halverson busied himself with something below the counter. Clara began to list her items without waiting for him to ask. It was when they were nearly done that Pastor Odell came in. Odell was a narrow man with a narrow face and the eyes of someone who has appointed himself the keeper of a great many things that are not strictly his to keep. He greeted Clara with practiced warmth and then turned that warmth off like a lamp when he looked at Cord. "I've been meaning to speak to someone about the situation out at the Whitmore property," Odell said, to no one in particular. The room listened with the attentiveness of a room that has been waiting. "Speak," Cord said. Odell blinked. He'd expected Clara, perhaps. Not the direct address. "I simply feel that, as a matter of community concern, it's irregular. A man of unknown provenance living on a widow's land. There are impressionable children, there are," Cord said, "who've been building fence lines and hauling wood and keeping the house since their father died. They're good children. You ought to know them better. I mean, no offense to the children, then don't manufacture a fence on their behalf." Cord's voice remained level throughout. He hadn't raised it and he didn't intend to. Level, in his experience, carried further than loud. Their mother is sick and getting better. The land needs work and it's getting it. That's all there is. Odell opened his mouth and found he had less to say than he'd expected. He looked at Clara, perhaps hoping for an ally in propriety. Clara said, "Mr. Cord has been decent. More decent than most." She said it quietly and without apparent emotion, which made it land harder than if she'd been passionate about it. "I'll need a spool of that cotton thread, Walt." "The brown one." Halverson got the thread. They loaded the wagon without further conversation from Pastor Odell, though Cord could feel the man watching from the doorway of the dry goods store as they pulled away. He didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury you earned after the danger was past. On the wagon seat, heading out of town, Clara said, "Thank you. Didn't do much." "You did plenty." She watched the road ahead. "He'd have talked at me for 20 minutes if you hadn't said what you said. And I'm too tired for 20 minutes. Caleb, in the wagon bed, said nothing. But Cord caught the boy looking at him with an expression that was careful and assessing and not unkind, which was, he had come to understand, approximately how Caleb showed everything. The road back was long and the afternoon sun reduced itself to something livable and the scrubland on either side moved in the slow current of hot air coming up from the south. Clara dozed against the wagon seat. Caleb eventually leaned back against the supplies and watched the sky. Cord drove the team and kept his eyes moving out of old habit, reading the Land's Edge the way other men read text, looking for anything that didn't belong. He found nothing. Not yet. But there was a pressure in the air that he recognized the way you recognize the smell before a storm. Something was orienting itself in their direction. He could feel it the way old brakes feel weather. He drove on and said nothing about it. The night it happened, the moon was up and full and generous with its light, which was both useful and inconvenient. Useful for seeing. Inconvenient because whatever came out of the dark could see back. Cord lay in the barn in the way he'd learned to lie in many places over many years, still enough to look asleep, aware enough to be something else entirely. The mare shifted in her stall. Once. Twice. Then she went quiet in the particular way horses go quiet when they've smelled something they're thinking about. He was already on his feet before she'd finished deciding. He moved to the barn door and opened it 6 inches and stood in the gap and let his eyes work the yard. The house was dark. The fence line was shadow. The scrub oaks along the far edge of the property were a dark wall against the luminous sky. There. Movement at the tree line. 2 shapes. Walking slow and careful in the way men walk when they believe they are unseen. They were heading for the house. Cord eased out of the barn and moved in the opposite direction, using the barn's shadow to carry him along the fence line, angling to come around behind them. His boots were soft on the dry ground. He moved the way he'd learned to move a long time ago, which was to say not like water, which was the poetic comparison and was wrong, but like the land itself shifting, incrementally. Without announcement. He came up behind the nearer of the 2 men while the man was still watching the house. He pressed the barrel of the Colt into the back of the man's neck, just below the ear, where the pressure of cold steel communicates with perfect clarity. "Don't," Cord said. 1 word. The man froze. His companion turned, hand going for iron, and found Cord had pivoted just enough that the angle covered both of them. You learn geometry differently with a gun. The mathematics become urgent. "Both hands where I can see them," Cord said. "And when you've done that, you're going to tell me who sent you. Not because I don't already know, but because I want to hear you say it." The second man, younger, with a mustache he hadn't quite earned yet, said, "Nobody sent us. We're just passing through. Men passing through don't come through a property's back tree line at 2 in the morning walking soft." Silence. "Pruitt," the first man said. He said it flatly, with the defeated sound of a man who had calculated the situation and found that loyalty to his employer did not quite outweigh the arithmetic of where Cord's barrel was resting. "Pruitt want the house or the woman?" "The land." "Just the land." "He's got a man at the county recorder's office says the title's up for dispute." "He wanted," the man stopped. "He wanted her gone before September," Cord said. "Or scared enough to sign something she shouldn't sign." "Nothing. You're going to go back to Pruitt," Cord said. "And you're going to tell him that the Whitmore property is occupied and attended to and that anyone who steps foot on it without invitation will be met accordingly." He removed the barrel from the man's neck and stepped back, still covering both. "You tell him Cord said so." The younger man said, "He won't care." "I know," Cord said. "Tell him anyway." He watched them go back through the tree line. He listened to the sound of horses moving away south, through the scrub, at a pace that said they were not interested in reconsidering. Then he stood in the moonlit yard for a long time after the sound faded, thinking. He was still standing there when the lamp came on in the house. Clara came out onto the porch wrapped in a quilt, moving carefully but under her own power. She looked at him across the yard. He walked to the porch and stood at the foot of the steps. "I heard voices," she said. "2 men. They're gone. Pruitt's men." She said it without surprise, which told him she'd been expecting this in the way that people expect things they have been dreading for long enough. He looked at her face in the lamplight from the door. She was frightened, but she was not unraveling. There is a kind of courage that doesn't announce itself and is all the more real for that. "He's going to keep coming," she said. "He wants the land." "I know. And when the season turns and I'm well, I'll be alone out here again," and she stopped. Pulled the quilt tighter. "I'm not asking you to stay. I'm not asking you for anything. I just need to understand what I'm facing. You're facing a man who wants something he doesn't own and thinks time and pressure will get it for him." Cord put his foot on the first step of the porch. He's not wrong that time and pressure work on people. He'd have been right, before. Before what? Before tonight. Before I know what he's planning and what the window is. He paused. There's a way to shut this down that's cleaner than me standing in the yard with a gun every night. But you'd have to trust me on it. She studied him for a long time. The night moved around them, warm and smelling of dry grass and distance. I trusted you with my children's supper, she said finally. I expect I can trust you with the rest. She turned back to the door. Come inside. I'll make coffee and you can tell me what you're thinking. Inside, the house was warm from the banked stove. Caleb sat at the table in his nightshirt, pretending he'd just come for water. May was not pretending anything. She sat in the chair by the window with the rifle across her knees and watched Cord sit down with the evaluating calm of a small general reviewing the situation. Cord sat down at the table, and for the first time since he'd ridden into Calhoun Flats, he felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Not safety exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something he recognized, distantly, as the sensation of being where he was supposed to be, which was a feeling he had not had in a very long time. He told them what he was thinking. Clara listened without interrupting. Caleb listened and asked one question, which was a good question. May listened and said nothing, but at some point she put the rifle down, which Cord took to mean she had rendered a judgment. Cord rode into Calhoun Flats alone the next morning. He went first to the office of Arbuckle and Sons, which was a law firm in the way that a frontier town could accommodate a law firm, one actual lawyer, Emmett Arbuckle, who had read law in Missouri and come west for reasons he rarely discussed, and a desk large enough to suggest institutional authority even when the institution was mostly one tired man with a leather satchel. Arbuckle was in his 50s, thick through the middle, with spectacles he was always either looking over or forgetting where he'd left them. He was, Cord had been told by the barber that morning in passing, honest enough for the territory. Cord laid out the situation without embellishment. He described Pruitt, the title dispute, the 90-day window, the two men in the yard. He described John Whitmore's original filing and the gap that Clara's illness had left in her ability to defend it. He described the children. Arbuckle listened with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes on Cord. When Cord was done, the lawyer was quiet for a moment. There is a mechanism, Arbuckle said carefully, for securing a contested title when the original filing party is deceased. It requires either a direct heir who can make claim, which the children can do, but they're minors, which complicates the representation, or... He stopped. Or, Cord said, a legal spouse. If Mrs. Whitmore were to remarry, her husband would hold legal standing to contest Pruitt's claim through the county recorder's office. Pruitt's case rests on the argument that the land is effectively untenanted by a legally recognized claimant. A marriage would close that argument entirely. He paused. That is, if you were suggesting what I believe you might be suggesting. What would you need from us? Cord said. A license, a ceremony of some kind that can be witnessed, and signatures. The rest is filing. I can have it recorded before Pruitt's agent gets word of it. Arbuckle studied him. This is a significant step, Mr. Cord. For both parties. I know what it is. Does Mrs. Whitmore? She will when I tell her. Arbuckle took off his spectacles, breathed on them, cleaned them with his sleeve in the habitual way of a man whose thinking is often done through that gesture. Come back this afternoon with Mrs. Whitmore and any willing witnesses. I'll have the paperwork prepared. Cord stood. He put on his hat. He stopped at the door. Arbuckle, he said. Can you send word to the county recorder's office yourself? Before Pruitt's man gets there to file anything. I have a boy who rides fast, Arbuckle said. Send him now, Cord said, and went out. He told Clara when he got back. They sat at the kitchen table, Caleb and May outside doing what he'd given them to keep busy, the house quiet around them with the particular quality of quiet that surrounds an important conversation. He told her plainly what Pruitt was doing, the legal mechanism, what he was proposing. He told her he understood what it was and what it wasn't, and that he would not dress it up as something convenient. He told her she could refuse and he would find another way. She was quiet for a long time after. She looked at her hands on the table, the knuckles that were only now beginning to heal from the months of working through sickness. "You don't know me," she said. "Not really." "No," he agreed. "And I don't know you." "That's accurate. You could be any kind of man underneath." She looked up at him. "You could have followed those two out of here this morning and kept going." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" He thought about answering carefully and then decided not to. Because Caleb stood in the street and held out everything he had in the world, and the look on his face was the bravest thing I've seen in 20 years of looking at things that are supposed to be brave. He paused. "And because your daughter put a rifle across her knees at 2 in the morning to protect her family and she didn't flinch, and I have never in my life walked away from that kind of courage. It would have felt like an insult." Clara was still. Then she said, "It would be a legal arrangement." "Yes. And I'd have the right to ask you to leave, after. Once the land is clear." "You would. And you wouldn't hold that against me." "No." She looked at him for a long time with those clear, exhausted, assessing eyes. Then she said, "All right. Let me get my good dress." Pastor Odell was not the officiant. That detail was unavoidable. Odell would have required a week of consultation and would have imposed conditions, and there was not time. Arbuckle himself had a county commission that permitted him to perform marriages in the absence of clergy. A provision the territory had implemented for practical reasons that made sense in a place where clergy was intermittent and necessity was not. They did it in Arbuckle's office. Clara wore a dress the color of pine shadow with buttons at the cuff that she'd had to ask May to fasten because her hands were still not entirely reliable for fine work. Cord wore his cleanest shirt and had shaved at the barber shop and left his hat on the chair in the corner for the duration of the ceremony, which lasted 11 minutes including the signing. Caleb stood beside his mother and was absolutely still for the entire 11 minutes except for one moment when Clara said "I do" in her quiet, measured voice, at which point his throat moved once. May stood on the other side of Clara and held her mother's hand throughout. She looked at Cord once during the ceremony, directly, with all of her considerable seriousness, and he looked back at her and nodded once, very slightly, and she looked away. Arbuckle filed the paperwork himself, riding to the county seat that same afternoon with a steel bag and the expression of a man who is doing something he intends to do correctly. He arrived before Pruitt's land agent, who had been delayed by a conveniently slow livery horse, and the deed was recorded in the name of Clara Cord, née Whitmore, and her legal husband Elias Cord. And Pruitt's 90-day window became irrelevant the moment the clerk's stamp came down. Pruitt, when he heard, said nothing in particular. He was a pragmatic man. He had other land to pursue, other windows, other pressures. He moved on in the way that certain kinds of men move on, not defeated exactly, but redirected. He did not come to Calhoun Flats himself. He did not send more men. There was, as of that filing, nothing in Calhoun Flats worth the expense of his attention. The town of Calhoun Flats, for its part, underwent the gradual shift in perception that small towns undergo when the story they've been telling is replaced by one that actually happened. Pastor Odell preached a sermon that Sunday about the sanctity of Christian charity and the importance of community support for widows and their children, which most people understood was as close as he could come to acknowledging he'd been wrong about the Whitmores without saying so directly. Walt Halverson extended Clara a line of credit she had not previously been offered. The women of the town began to appear at the Whitmore property on Saturdays, sometimes with food, sometimes with help. In the way of communities that have decided to adopt a family after having briefly considered rejecting them. Cord worked the land. He finished the fence Caleb's father had started, and then he built an addition to the barn because the barn needed it, and then he turned the dry creek bed at the property line, cutting a small channel to divert water from the spring rains, which a man 3 miles over had taught him to do years ago in exchange for a meal and a kind word. The land, given water, responded with the inarticulate gratitude of land everywhere, which is to say it simply grew. Caleb worked beside him. The boy was learning day by day, in the way boys learn from men when the men are present and patient and mean what they say. He asked questions when he had them and was quiet when he didn't, and the questions were getting better, which Cord took as a sign of general progress. May, over several weeks, began to leave the rifle in the corner more often. Not always, but more often. Clara recovered. She recovered in the slow, real way of someone who has been genuinely ill and gives the recovery the time it requires, not rushing it, not pretending to be further along than she was. Cord brought her lemon drops from Halverson's when her throat was sore, which it was for a week in early September, and left them on the windowsill without comment, and she ate them without comment. And that was how certain things between them were transacted, without language but without ambiguity either. The arrangement, which had begun as legal strategy, found its shape in the spaces between what had been agreed to. It did not happen dramatically. It happened the way the fence got finished, one post at a time, each one set deep enough to hold through weather. There is a particular quality to the light on the plains in late September that has no equivalent in any other season or any other place. It comes down at an angle that makes everything it touches look like it is being remembered even while you're standing in it, the fence posts, the barn wall. The kitchen garden Clara had planted along the south side of the house, now gone to its late growth, the yellow-green of it in that angled light something close to impossible. Cord stood at the barn door in the early evening watching it. He thought about Caleb in the street, holding out $3 silver with both hands, the way you offer something to whatever power you believe in when you have nothing else to offer. He thought about what it cost a child to do that, to walk up to a man like Cord, who carried everything that men like Cord carry visibly on them, and not flinch. To trust that something in the universe would answer the offering. He thought about May's rifle and May's silence and the way she'd put the rifle down. He thought about Clara saying, "I expect I can trust you with the rest." The broken places on that land, the unfinished fence, the dry creek, the windows with their paper patches, had become, by degrees, repaired places. Not perfect. The barn still leaned slightly, and probably always would. The window sash fit in precisely and let in cold air around the edge in winter and always would. These were not failures. These were the marks of a life that had been interrupted and had, nonetheless, resumed. What Cord had learned, in a long life of moving from place to place and rarely looking back, was that broken things are not ruined things. That the difference between the two is exactly this, whether something is there to hold it together while the repair takes hold. He heard Caleb's voice from inside, explaining something to May with great authority. He heard May dispute it with one flat sentence. He heard Clara say something that settled the matter and made both of them quiet in the way that mothers alone can make children quiet. He put on his hat and went inside for supper. The light came in through the repaired window and lay itself gently across the table, and the food was ready, and there was room enough at the table for everyone. Outside, the plains stretched in every direction, vast and indifferent and beautiful, the way country is when it does not know it has become someone's home. But it had. Quietly, post by post, meal by meal, small gesture by small gesture, it had. Some debts cannot be paid in silver. Some of them are paid in presents. In staying. In the decision, made without ceremony on an ordinary evening, to set the hat on the hook by the door and sit down at the table and call it home.